Welcome back, history lovers. Today we're diving into a world that's rarely talked about, the dangerous, grueling, and often misunderstood life of medieval bards. From traveling treacherous roads to surviving disease, dirt, and the scrutiny of powerful patrons and the church, their story is as thrilling as it is heartbreaking. Before we jump in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating history videos, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an epic story from the past. Now, let's uncover why it really sucked to be a medieval bard, and so much more. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world as it was 1,000 years ago. Europe is a patchwork of forests, hills, and small villages, dotted with stone castles and wooden hovels, where the rhythm of life is dictated not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the seasons, by the cries of animals in the fields, and by the tolling of church bells that mark both the sacred and the mundane. It is a time of both beauty and brutality, where the boundaries between survival and suffering are thin and easily crossed, where every day carries the potential for wonder, but also the inevitability of hardship. Now, in the midst of this world, picture a solitary figure walking along a muddy road. A worn cloak hangs from his shoulders, a lute or a harp strapped awkwardly to his back. His boots are caked with mud, his hands rough and calloused, his hair tangled from weeks of travel, his stomach growling from lack of food, yet his eyes shine with a glimmer of hope, a fragile hope that the next village, the next castle, the next tavern might offer warmth, a meal, or at least a listening ear. This is the medieval bard, often romanticized in our stories and songs, yet the truth of their existence is far more complex, far darker, far more precarious than the tales suggest. When we think of bards, we imagine charm, laughter, music that fills a room, tales of heroism, tales of love, tales that make kings and peasants alike pause in awe. We imagine a figure who is celebrated, revered, perhaps even envied for their ability to weave words and music into something magical. A bard might strum a lute by the fireside of a castle hall, singing of knights who conquer dragons, of loves that endure despite impossible odds, of battles fought with courage and cunning. Patrons offer coins, meals, or even a bed for the night. The bard smiles, raises a cup of wine, and life seems, at least for a moment, like poetry itself. But now open your eyes and consider the other side of that story, the side that history often forgets, because the life of a medieval bard was not in truth a life of poetry. It was a life of struggle, uncertainty, and constant danger. The romantic image hides the harsh realities: hunger, cold, disease, physical abuse, social marginalization, and a precarious existence that depended entirely on the whims of strangers. Unlike knights, who held land and titles, unlike merchants, who could amass wealth over time, bards were entirely dependent on the favor of others, and favor could vanish in an instant. A smile from a lord could feed you, while a scowl could see you thrown into the mud. Songs that pleased one audience could offend another, sometimes with deadly consequences. To truly understand why it sucked to be a medieval bard, one must first understand the world they inhabited. Medieval Europe was a place of extreme social hierarchy. Kings ruled over kingdoms, nobles over lands and peasants, clergy over both spiritual and temporal matters. Most people were bound to the land, tied to the whims of their lords, their lives dictated by seasons, taxes, and the labor demanded of them. In such a rigid society, the bard occupied a strange liminal space, neither fully part of the nobility nor entirely belonging to the common folk. They were outsiders, dependent on the generosity of those in power, yet often mistrusted by the same. They traveled constantly, never able to put down roots, never able to claim security or stability. Their very livelihood required mobility, yet mobility was dangerous, exposing them to the elements, to bandits, to disease, and to the unpredictable temper of those who held power. Imagine, then, the mental and emotional strain of such a life. Every step along a muddy road carries uncertainty. Every village approach could be welcoming or hostile. Every song sung carries risk. A lyric misinterpreted, a story told in poor taste, or even a glance considered disrespectful could lead to punishment. There was no formal legal protection for a wandering entertainer. Justice was uneven, and those without land or title had little recourse. Physical abuse, humiliation, imprisonment, and even mutilation were not unheard of. Bards lived in a constant state of tension, their survival dependent on reading both the moods and the prejudices of the people they entertained. Consider, too, the physical demands of the job. A bard carried their instrument, sometimes large and cumbersome, across miles of treacherous terrain. The roads themselves were perilous, muddy in winter, dust-choked in summer, lined with hidden ditches and thick forests that hid thieves and wild animals alike. Inns and taverns, when they existed, were often crowded, unsanitary, and expensive. Sleeping outdoors meant exposure to cold, rain, snow, and disease. Malnutrition was common, food was scarce, especially for those with little money. Illness could strike at any moment, and medical care for the poor was almost non-existent. A fever that could be easily treated today might mean death in the Middle Ages. A bard who fell ill on the road could be left behind by traveling companions, left to die alone in the forest or in a squalid village. Yet despite these hardships, bards persisted. Why? Because music and storytelling were not merely entertainment, they were tools of survival. A skilled bard could gain access to castles, inns, and wealthy patrons, even if only temporarily. Songs could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. Stories preserved history, culture, and memory. And for those who had little else, a peasant child seeking escape, an orphan without inheritance, a social outcast, a bard's life, for all its peril, offered freedom from the rigid structures of society. But freedom came at a cost, exposure to danger, hunger, humiliation, and relentless uncertainty. The psychological burden must have been immense. Imagine performing for a room full of strangers, knowing that one mistake could result in beatings, imprisonment, or worse. Imagine the constant anxiety of travel, never knowing whether the next town would welcome you or turn you away. Imagine the loneliness of a life on the road, separated from family, friends, or any stable community. Many bards formed temporary alliances with other entertainers, but these relationships were often fleeting, as each sought survival in a competitive environment where resources were scarce. Trust was hard to come by. Betrayal could be life-threatening. And yet society demanded entertainment. Festivals, weddings, religious celebrations, and court gatherings all required music and storytelling. Bards were necessary, yet undervalued. Their work was expected but rarely rewarded adequately. Nobles might enjoy a song one night, but their appreciation seldom translated into long-term support. Coins given were often meager, meals shared were temporary, and lodging was rarely secure. The bard's art was simultaneously essential and disposable, cherished in the moment, forgotten the next. Furthermore, the very content of a bard's songs could be dangerous. Tales of kings and nobles, battles and betrayals, love and scandal, all could be politically sensitive. A song meant as entertainment could be construed as criticism, satire, or insult. Medieval lords had fragile egos, and offenses could be punished harshly. Historical records tell us of bards who were blinded, maimed, or executed for perceived slights. Freedom of expression, as we understand it today, did not exist. Survival required self-censorship, flattery, and careful reading of audiences' moods. Bards also had to contend with the moral and religious scrutiny of the medieval church. Music, storytelling, humor, and satire were sometimes viewed as sinful distractions from God. Wandering entertainers were suspected of spreading vice, tempting lust, or corrupting morals. In some regions, bards were forbidden from certain towns, denied entry to churches, or even barred from burial in consecrated ground. In life and death, they were marginalized. Despite these constant threats, bards created beauty. They wove songs that endured, that captured the imaginations of listeners, that preserved stories and histories that might otherwise have been lost. Their lives were precarious, but their art transcended that precarity. Every note struck, every word sung was an act of courage. Every performance was a gamble with fate, with society, with the forces of nature, and with the often cruel whims of humanity. So, the next time you picture a bard strumming a lute by a warm fire, remember the roads they traveled to get there, the hunger they endured, the fear that shadowed every step, the constant danger that hung over their heads. Remember that behind every enchanting melody lay a life of hardship, resilience, and relentless struggle. The glamour we associate with medieval bards is a veneer, a mask over a reality that was often grim and unforgiving. Survival, not fame or artistry, was the true measure of their lives. Being a medieval bard did not feel like magic. It did not feel like poetry. It felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm of uncertainty, hunger, and danger, armed only with talent, wit, and an unyielding hope that the next village, the next lord, the next performance might provide a reprieve. Their songs, their stories, their music were not merely entertainment. They were lifelines, fragile threads connecting them to survival, to community, to fleeting moments of recognition in a world that often sought to crush them. And yet they persisted. Despite every hardship, every insult, every mile walked in mud and snow, every meal missed, every night spent in fear, they persisted. Because music, art, and storytelling are not merely diversions, they are survival, resistance, and identity. And in that persistence lies the tragic, beautiful, and unforgettable truth of the medieval bard. In the Middle Ages, the line between survival and humiliation was razor thin, and the position of the bard sat precariously somewhere in between. While stories, songs, and music could bring delight to noble ears, the people who performed them were not celebrated as artists in the way we understand today. They were not elevated, not honored, and certainly not afforded the privileges or protections that might have made life secure. Instead, bards were entertainers, and to be an entertainer in medieval Europe was to exist in a constant state of vulnerability, always dependent on the whims of others. They were viewed as frivolous at best, suspicious at worst, a necessary nuisance whose value was measured by the immediate amusement they could provide rather than by any intrinsic cultural worth. Most bards did not come from wealth or privilege. Few were born into families with influence, property, or social standing. Many were children of peasants, orphans, or outcasts, individuals who had little choice but to wander in search of opportunities. Unlike the knights who inherited land, titles, and weapons, or the merchants who built trade networks that could sustain generations, bards possessed nothing but their skill with music, storytelling, and sometimes dance. They carried no wealth, no legal protections, and no assurances that the next town or castle would welcome them. Their livelihood depended entirely on the generosity, or, more accurately, the mercy of strangers. To perform was to risk everything, pride, body, and occasionally life. Consider for a moment the reality of that dependence. A bard arrived at a castle or manor, uncertain if the lord of the household would permit entry, uncertain if the servants would provide water or fire, uncertain if the townsfolk would tolerate their presence. Hospitality in the medieval period was uneven and conditional. A smile from a lord could mean a warm meal and a bed for the night. A frown could mean being cast into the cold. For a traveling entertainer, there was no guarantee of reciprocity, no social contract beyond what could be negotiated in the moment. Every interaction carried the weight of consequence. One misstep, a song performed with unintended satire, a glance deemed disrespectful, a story that hinted at truth the powerful would rather ignore, could result in insult, physical punishment, or banishment. The social standing of bards was complicated further by the structure of medieval society itself. Europe at this time was rigidly hierarchical. Kings ruled over realms, dukes over provinces, lords over manors, and peasants toiled over fields they did not own. To exist outside of these layers was to occupy a liminal space, and the bard's position was exactly that, a liminal figure, always on the borders of social order, neither fully respected nor fully distrusted, yet always subject to its rules and mercies. They were outsiders, observers, chroniclers, and commentators, yet their opinions, no matter how clever or insightful, carried little weight. The ability to sing, recite, or play an instrument might win temporary admiration, but it did not buy authority or security. This tension between value and vulnerability defined much of a bard's existence. They were simultaneously needed and marginalized. Lords, nobles, and townsfolk demanded entertainment for festivals, weddings, feasts, and religious holidays, but they expected it cheaply, if not for free. The bard was expected to amuse, to delight, and to elevate the mood of gatherings, yet the rewards for doing so were inconsistent at best. A few coins tossed on a plate, a crust of bread, or a mug of wine might suffice. And sometimes they did not even receive that. Patrons could be generous one night and hostile the next. One bard could be celebrated in one village and chased out of the next. There was no stable patronage unless one was exceptionally lucky, skilled, or well-connected. The itinerant life that bards were forced to lead brought with it an array of dangers. Roads were treacherous. The landscapes through which bards traveled were unforgiving, dense forests that hid wolves or robbers, rivers without bridges, marshes that swallowed the unwary, and mountains that became perilous in winter snow. Travel was on foot for most, and carrying instruments, harps, lutes, fiddles, or flutes, added to the physical strain. Instruments were delicate, easily broken, yet essential. A bard without an instrument was a soldier without a sword. They could survive, but their value, their means of survival, was greatly diminished. The weight of the instrument, combined with food scarcity, exposure to harsh weather, and the need to avoid predators, both human and animal, made every journey a challenge to endurance and resilience. Moreover, bards were constantly at risk of exploitation. Some nobles would invite them into their halls with promises of hospitality, only to demand free performances or make unreasonable demands. Some innkeepers would overcharge or provide substandard lodging. Bandits roamed the roads, sometimes attacking travelers for any valuables they could carry, and a bard traveling alone or in a small group was an easy target. Theft, violence, and betrayal were constant threats. Even among other traveling entertainers, competition could turn dangerous, as bards often relied on the same limited resources, towns, patrons, and audiences. Alliances were temporary and fragile, and trust was a commodity more rare than gold. Yet bards had to navigate these dangers with diplomacy and intelligence. The ability to read a room, to understand a lord's temperament, to gauge the reactions of villagers, was as critical as musical skill. A song performed incorrectly, or a story told at the wrong moment, could be disastrous. Historical records provide chilling examples. Bards punished for minor missteps, sometimes blinded or having fingers cut off to prevent further performances. The world demanded that bards entertain but punish them for mistakes that would have been trivial in other contexts. Their art was inseparable from their risk, inseparable from their survival. The mental and emotional toll of such a life cannot be overstated. Constant vigilance, hyper-awareness of audience reactions, fear of physical punishment, anxiety about survival, loneliness, and isolation. It was a life lived under continuous stress. Relationships were fleeting, and attachments were dangerous, given the transient nature of their lives. Many bards formed bonds with other traveling entertainers, but even these were temporary, dictated by opportunity and circumstance rather than choice or stability. Families were rare, and children born to bards often grew up with uncertainty, poverty, or abandonment. The life of a bard was not conducive to normal social structures or emotional security. Religious pressures added another layer of complexity. The medieval church was powerful, controlling both spiritual and temporal aspects of life. Music, storytelling, and performance were sometimes regarded with suspicion. Wandering entertainers could be accused of promoting vice, distracting people from piety, or spreading heresy. The moral and spiritual scrutiny applied to bards could result in restrictions on where they could perform, what they could perform, and even their right to live in certain areas. In some cases, bards were denied burial in consecrated ground, an ultimate social and spiritual exclusion. Their art, essential to social life, was simultaneously condemned, leaving them vulnerable to judgment from multiple fronts. Despite these dangers, despite the harshness of their existence, bards persisted. They did so not because they were oblivious to risk, nor because they were invincible, but because the act of performing, of storytelling, and of music was intertwined with survival itself. A song could open a door, a story could win favor, a melody could secure a meal. Their art was not merely decorative, it was functional, a tool of negotiation, of diplomacy, and at times of self-preservation. Every note struck, every lyric sung, every tale recited was a calculated act, balancing art and survival, charm and caution, skill and wit. Bards were also crucial in preserving the culture and history of their time. In an era where literacy was rare and books expensive, stories were passed orally, and the bard was the living repository of memory. They carried tales of heroes, battles, love, and tragedy from village to village, town to town, and castle to castle. They kept alive the histories and myths that would otherwise have been lost. Yet this cultural importance did not translate into social respect. Their role was necessary but undervalued, essential but precarious. The contradictions of a bard's life are striking. They were revered for their skill, yet marginalized for their social standing. They were sought after for entertainment, yet punished for missteps. They carried culture and memory across Europe, yet their personal security was often non-existent. They survived through ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability, but their daily existence was marked by hunger, exposure, physical danger, and the constant threat of punishment. To understand the life of a medieval bard is to understand the precariousness of human existence in a society governed by hierarchy, fear, and arbitrary power. The life of a bard challenges our modern notions of art and artist. Today we often separate the art from the artist, evaluating music, storytelling, and performance on aesthetic or emotional criteria. In the Middle Ages, however, the act of performing was inseparable from survival. Skill alone did not guarantee protection or success. Cunning, diplomacy, and social intelligence were equally critical. A bard's worth was measured not in mastery of melody, but in the ability to navigate an often hostile world while simultaneously pleasing the powerful and engaging the common folk. Their art was survival, and their survival was their art. In the end, the bard's existence illuminates the complexities of medieval society, the interdependence of social classes, the volatility of patronage, the dangers of mobility, the vulnerability of the powerless, and the essential yet undervalued role of art in human life. To be a bard was to live constantly in negotiation with one's environment, audience, and self. It was to walk a tightrope between admiration and punishment, between nourishment and hunger, between survival and extinction. The bard's world was one of uncertainty, danger, and relentless challenge, yet it was also a world of creativity, resilience, and the enduring power of story and song. Every step a bard took, every song performed, was an act of courage. Every mile traveled, every meal begged or earned, was a victory in the quiet, invisible battles of survival. While society often overlooked them, history, when we look closely, reveals their contributions, the stories that shaped culture, the music that carried emotion across generations, and the resilience of individuals who survived against constant odds. To imagine a medieval bard as merely a charming figure by a warm fire is to misunderstand the complexity of their existence. They were wanderers, survivors, diplomats, and cultural carriers, existing in a delicate balance between visibility and vulnerability, admiration and marginalization, life and death. Their art was inseparable from their struggle, their survival inseparable from their creativity. And it is in this precarious, perilous, and profoundly human existence that the true story of the medieval bard emerges. A story of danger, endurance, and the extraordinary resilience of those who sang, told, and played despite a world that often seemed set against them. Imagine standing in a dimly lit hall, the air thick with smoke from torches and braziers. The smell of roasted meat, sweat, and wine mixes into a heavy haze, clinging to the stone walls. You are a bard. Fingers hover over the strings of a lute, trembling slightly, not from fear of performance, but from the knowledge that one wrong note, one poorly chosen word, one misstep in timing could destroy you. For in the medieval world, a bard's existence was not cushioned by legal protections, social privilege, or immunity from retribution. Every song carried weight, every story could provoke reaction, and every audience included people whose tempers were as unpredictable as the wind. One wrong song could mean a beating, imprisonment, mutilation, or even death. The reality of performing as a bard was a perpetual negotiation with danger, a delicate dance along a razor's edge where survival and creativity were inseparably intertwined. It is tempting to romanticize the image of the bard, someone free-spirited, weaving tales of valor and love for the entertainment of all. In some ways they were free, at least from the rigidities of serfdom or the obligations of hereditary labor. Yet this freedom was conditional, fragile, and fraught with risk. The world of medieval courts and towns was governed by power, hierarchy, and sensitivity. Kings and lords ruled their domains with authority that was absolute within their walls. A jest misinterpreted, a story that hinted at scandal, a lyric that dared to critique or mock, intentional or accidental, could provoke outrage. And in a society where personal honor and reputation were fiercely defended, even the slightest perceived insult could trigger punishment that was swift, cruel, and unforgiving. The stakes were high because bards operated in a world without codified freedom of expression. Words were dangerous, music was dangerous, humor was dangerous, entertainment was both necessary and perilous. When a bard recited a tale, sang a song, or performed a play, it was not merely an act of amusement, it was a social experiment, a gamble with every individual in the room. The performance could bring joy and laughter, or it could provoke fury and violence. Consider a song that spoke of a king's foolishness, even indirectly. What might seem like harmless humor could be interpreted as sedition or disrespect. What might be intended as praise could be twisted into mockery. The interpretation was entirely in the hands of the listeners, and the listeners held the power of life or death over the bard. Historical records are filled with chilling examples of bards punished for their performances. There are accounts of bards who were blinded for satire, maimed to prevent further playing, or imprisoned for offending the wrong noble. A story that amused a village could be taken as criticism by a visiting lord. A joke about love could offend a husband or father. A tale of a battle could anger a knight who fought and survived, yet did not wish to be reminded of failure. Bards walked an invisible tightrope, balancing creativity with caution, art with diplomacy, and expression with survival. Their artistry was inseparable from their vulnerability, and their vulnerability inseparable from their artistry. The psychological burden of this constant risk cannot be overstated. Imagine crafting a song that must entertain an audience, flatter the powerful, and avoid offense, all at the same time. A bard had to be keenly observant, reading facial expressions, tone of voice and social context, adjusting lyrics on the fly, improvising music to suit moods, and always calculating the consequences of their choices. The skill required extended far beyond mere musical ability. It was an exercise in human psychology, in diplomacy, in survival strategy. Each performance was a test of intelligence, intuition, and courage. One mistake could undo months of careful preparation and effort. Bards did not have the luxury of repetition or rehearsal in private spaces. Most performances were public, often in unfamiliar locations, with audiences whose temperaments and backgrounds varied wildly. One hall might be filled with peasants, eager for entertainment but harsh in judgment. Another might include nobles with refined tastes, but little tolerance for perceived criticism. Yet another might host a mix of clergy, travelers, and soldiers, each group carrying its own sensitivities, prejudices, and expectations. To perform successfully, the bard had to anticipate reactions, manage emotions, and adapt in real time. A misplaced chord, a poorly phrased metaphor, or even an unintentional gesture could provoke outrage. And outrage in medieval Europe could be brutal. Punishments for perceived disrespect were not symbolic, they were physical, immediate, and severe. Accounts suggest that some bards had fingers cut off to prevent them from playing instruments, effectively ending their livelihoods. Others were blinded to punish their perceived insolence or satire. Some were publicly humiliated, chained, or whipped in front of audiences as a warning to others. Even imprisonment was perilous, as jails were unsanitary, overcrowded, and breeding grounds for disease. Survival depended not only on skill but also on luck, timing, and the ability to appease those in power. The pressure of this precarious existence extended to creativity itself. Bards had to continuously produce new material, but innovation carried risk. A new song could delight, or it could offend. A clever story could amuse, or it could provoke. Repetition, though safer, could bore patrons, leading to loss of favor, coins, or sustenance. The bard's life was a perpetual tension between creativity and caution, originality and safety. The act of performing was simultaneously an artistic expression and a calculated survival strategy. Each note, each word, each story was imbued with stakes that modern performers rarely, if ever, encounter. Traveling bards faced additional layers of risk because the consequences of offense were not confined to a single location. A bard insulted a powerful lord in one town could be banned from neighboring regions, leaving them without income, shelter, or access to food. Reputation traveled alongside the performer, for good or ill. A misstep in one court could echo across miles, making survival increasingly precarious. The need to protect oneself extended beyond immediate performance. It required awareness of social networks, local politics, and the dynamics of power. The bard was a social navigator, balancing multiple audiences, histories, and expectations simultaneously. This constant vigilance took a psychological toll. Fear, anxiety, and stress were omnipresent. Bards could not perform with abandon. Humor was measured, stories carefully tailored, music modulated to avoid offense. Mistakes could be catastrophic. Yet they had to perform, as performance was their means of sustenance. Hunger, exposure, and poverty demanded courage, adaptability, and endurance. The emotional labor was immense. Every performance required mastery of self, audience, and art, while simultaneously managing risk and expectation. Bards were also subject to the moral and religious scrutiny of the church. Music, humor, and storytelling could be considered temptations or distractions from piety. Songs about love, passion, or social critique could be interpreted as morally corrupt or even heretical. A misjudged story could result in censure or exclusion. In some cases, wandering entertainers were denied access to certain towns, barred from public spaces, or forbidden from participating in religious festivals. Even in regions where tolerance was greater, subtle pressures existed to conform to prevailing moral norms. A bard's creativity was constantly constrained by both fear of temporal authority and spiritual oversight. In addition to the immediate social and moral dangers, the personal stakes were high. Many bards were already vulnerable due to poverty, lack of family support, or social marginalization. Losing favor with a patron could mean going hungry for days, weeks, or months. Losing access to a town or region could strand a bard on treacherous roads with little shelter and no means of survival. Every performance was thus a calculation of risk versus reward, a delicate balance between expression and survival, between daring and prudence. Yet, despite all this, bards persisted. Their art was not merely for amusement, it was a means of survival, a tool of negotiation, a form of resilience. Music and storytelling carried power, opening doors, forging alliances, and preserving cultural memory. Every song sung, every story recited was an act of courage, a defiance of the dangers inherent in their world. The bard's existence was a constant reminder that creativity and survival were inseparably linked, and that the consequences of expression in a world dominated by hierarchy, power, and intolerance were real, immediate, and often brutal. The life of a medieval bard was a perpetual dance on a knife's edge. Each performance was both a declaration of skill and a negotiation for life itself. Bards had to master not only music and storytelling, but also diplomacy, psychology, and risk assessment. Their talent was inseparable from their strategy, their art inseparable from their survival. They were, in essence, living tests of human adaptability, resilience, and courage. To imagine a bard standing in a hall, fingers poised over a lute, heart racing, aware that one wrong song could destroy their livelihood, reputation, or life, is to glimpse the reality behind the romanticized image of medieval performers. They were not merely entertainers, they were navigators of danger, survivors of social and political hazards, and custodians of culture. Every melody, every lyric, every story was a calculated act, and every performance carried consequences far beyond mere applause. The consequences of a single mistake could ripple across towns and courts, affecting not only immediate survival but long-term reputation and mobility. A misjudged jest could make a bard persona non grata in multiple regions, cutting off food, shelter, and income. The delicate balance of flattery, subtlety, and creativity was central to the bard's survival strategy. And yet, despite the constant threat of punishment, the uncertainty of patronage, and the ever-present dangers of travel, bards continued to perform. Their persistence is a testament to human resilience, to the power of art as survival, and to the extraordinary courage required to exist in a society that could be both appreciative and deadly in equal measure. Ultimately, the medieval bard's life teaches us about the fragility of freedom, the perilous nature of expression, and the high stakes of creativity in a world governed by hierarchical power, social scrutiny, and moral oversight. It reveals the extraordinary courage required simply to exist, to speak, to sing, and to tell stories in the face of constant danger. To perform was not a casual act. It was a gamble, a survival strategy, and an expression of human tenacity that transcended the immediate risks and left a legacy that echoes even today. Imagine leaving a village at dawn, your lute slung awkwardly across your back, the early mist clinging to your cloak and soaking your hair. The road stretches before you, muddy, uneven, and lined with dense forests that seem to whisper warnings in the morning light. Every step is uncertain, every path holds potential danger. For a medieval bard, this is not a picturesque journey, it is survival. The idyllic images we conjure of wandering musicians strolling through sunlit meadows are lies told by later storytellers. In truth, life on the road was arduous, lonely, and often life-threatening. Bards faced freezing winds, rain that turned roads into rivers of mud, scorching summer heat, and all the hazards that come from traveling across a landscape that is both untamed and unforgiving. There were no paved roads, no maps, no inns every few miles. Villages were scattered, often a day's journey apart, sometimes more. Forests could hide wild animals or bandits, rivers had no bridges and could sweep away the unwary, and the mountains or hills could be treacherous in winter, coated with ice or impassable snow. The instruments bards carried, harps, lutes, fiddles, or flutes, were both their livelihood and a physical burden. They were fragile yet essential, heavy or cumbersome, and vulnerable to the elements. A broken string, a snapped neck, or a damaged lute could end a performance before it even began, leaving the bard without income, without food, and without hope of temporary safety. The road itself was a battlefield of exhaustion and survival. Hunger was a constant companion. Food had to be begged, bartered, or earned, and what was available was often meager and unsanitary. Breads were coarse, sometimes moldy, vegetables were limited, meat was rare except in the presence of patrons, water sources were unreliable and often contaminated. Starvation, dehydration, and malnutrition were ever-present threats. Travelers like bards, who had no permanent shelter or income, were particularly vulnerable. A few days without food could sap strength, leaving a bard unable to perform, carry their instrument, or navigate treacherous terrain. Exposure to the elements was another constant hazard. Winter nights were bitterly cold, and even a fire in a village hall could not fully protect against frostbite or hypothermia if one had to sleep outside. Rain-soaked clothes and cloaks, leaving a bard chilled and shivering. Summer heat baked the roads, sometimes cracking the skin, dehydrating the body, and making the long hours of walking unbearable. Illnesses such as fevers, infections, and dysentery were common and could strike at any moment. Medical care was largely non-existent, especially for the poor and itinerant. A sprained ankle or infected wound could become fatal without proper attention. Traveling alone or in small groups increased the risk. If a companion fell ill or was injured, there was often no one to help, and the sick were sometimes abandoned on the road. Bandits and thieves were a perpetual danger. The medieval roads were lawless in many regions, especially far from fortified towns or castles. A bard traveling alone or lightly armed was an easy target. Robbery could mean the loss of a precious instrument, coins, or personal belongings, all critical for survival. Some bards were beaten or threatened with death. Even when traveling in small groups, safety was not guaranteed. Trust was difficult to establish, alliances were fragile, and betrayal could be fatal. The threat of violence loomed as constantly as the physical exhaustion of the journey. Accommodation was another challenge. Inns existed, but they were often overcrowded, unsanitary, or expensive. The poorest bards might be forced to sleep in stables, barns, or open fields, exposed to the cold, rain, or snow. Wildlife and vermin added further danger. Wolves, foxes, or other predators could attack, and disease-carrying rats were common in villages and towns. Even when indoors, bards were at the mercy of hosts. Generosity could be fleeting, and a single insult or displeased guest could mean eviction in the dead of night. Shelter was never guaranteed, and comfort was a luxury rarely afforded. Travel was also mentally exhausting. Every day required constant vigilance. Roads were unfamiliar, maps were unreliable or non-existent, and local customs and laws could vary from one town to the next. A gesture acceptable in one region could be considered offensive in another. Social missteps could provoke hostility or violence. Bards had to navigate not only physical landscapes but social and cultural landscapes, interpreting behaviors, moods, and expectations while performing under extreme pressure. This required intelligence, adaptability, and awareness at all times. Bards faced isolation as well. Life on the road meant leaving behind family, friends, and familiar communities. Temporary companionship with other traveling performers or fellow bards could offer some relief, but these alliances were fleeting. Loneliness was pervasive. Human connection, so vital for mental health, was difficult to maintain. Even the act of performance, while social, carried stress and expectation rather than companionship. Audiences were often strangers, and the need to entertain, flatter, and survive overshadowed any sense of belonging. Disease and poor health compounded the difficulties of travel. With little access to clean water, proper food, or medical attention, bards were highly susceptible to infections, fevers, and chronic ailments. Wounds could become infected, colds could develop into pneumonia, and minor illnesses could escalate into death. The physical toll of constant walking, carrying heavy instruments, exposure to the elements, and lack of nutrition weakened the body, making bards especially vulnerable. Many did not live past their 30s or 40s, and few reached old age. Their lives were brief and harsh, often punctuated by moments of temporary reprieve, when they performed and earned enough for food and shelter. Bards also faced social marginalization. Though their art was valued in the moment, society often saw them as outsiders. They belonged neither fully to the noble class nor to the peasantry. Their transient nature, combined with dependence on patronage, rendered them socially vulnerable. In some regions, local authorities or clergy viewed wandering entertainers with suspicion. Accusations of immorality, heresy, or laziness were common. Even when they performed admirably, bards rarely gained lasting recognition or security. Their mobility, a necessity for survival, also kept them perpetually on the edge of social networks, always dependent on temporary goodwill. Weather, terrain, and the physical landscape were relentless challenges. Rivers without bridges, hills and valleys that sapped strength, forests that obscured paths and hid threats, mud and snow that slowed progress. All were part of the daily reality. The roads were dangerous in more ways than one. An accident could leave a bard stranded, unable to travel or perform. The physical burden of carrying instruments, clothing, food, and personal belongings added to fatigue. Every day was a test of endurance, resilience, and adaptability. Despite these immense hardships, bards continued to travel. Their art was their livelihood, their means of negotiating the world, and often their only path to survival. Songs and stories could open doors to towns, inns, and castles. They could secure temporary meals, shelter, and coins. Music and storytelling were not luxuries. They were essential tools for living in a world that offered little security. The act of traveling itself became a skill, a survival strategy. The bard learned to read terrain, weather patterns, and social cues, developing intuition that allowed them to navigate a complex and dangerous world. Even in the face of constant danger, bards found moments of beauty and solace. The rising sun over a quiet village, the reflection of moonlight on a river, the sound of birds in a forest clearing, the shared laughter of children in a village square. These fleeting moments could sustain them. Music and storytelling offered a reprieve not only for their audiences, but also for themselves. A song could transform a cold, lonely night into a moment of connection, if only temporarily. These moments were precious, yet they did not erase the pervasive hardships that defined life on the road. The life of a traveling bard also demanded ingenuity. To survive, they had to improvise constantly. Melodies had to be adapted to instruments in varying states of repair, stories tailored to different audiences, food and lodging secured through negotiation or persuasion. The bard became not just a performer but a strategist, a negotiator, and an opportunist. Every step, every note, every word was measured, calculated, and deployed to maximize survival and minimize risk. Their creativity was inseparable from necessity, and their art inseparable from endurance. The harshness of the road also shaped the mental and emotional character of bards. Resilience, patience, adaptability, and sharp awareness were essential traits. The ability to endure discomfort, isolation, and threat became a form of discipline. Every day presented new challenges: weather, illness, hunger, hostility, and social uncertainty. Yet to persist was to assert existence, to maintain autonomy, and to carry forward the cultural and historical narratives that were entrusted to them. The journey itself was a crucible, forging the strength, skill, and wisdom that allowed bards to survive where many others would have perished. In addition to physical and social hazards, bards faced economic instability. Performance was unpredictable. One night might bring coins, wine, and gratitude. Another might bring rejection, ridicule, or empty hands. The necessity of constant travel meant that there was rarely a steady income, and savings were scarce. Any misfortune, illness, theft, or accident could wipe out what little was earned, leaving a bard vulnerable and desperate. This financial precarity added to the stress and danger of the road, forcing bards to develop cunning, persuasion, and adaptability to maintain even a minimal level of survival. And yet, despite the relentless challenges, bards persisted. They traversed the roads, villages, forests, and castles of medieval Europe, carrying with them music, stories, history, and culture. Every step taken in rain, snow, or sun, every night spent under a tree or in a stinking barn, every song played in a hall of nobles or in a smoky tavern was an act of courage. The road, though brutal, was also the path that allowed them to connect disparate communities, to preserve knowledge, and to ensure that the voices of the past were not entirely lost. To imagine a medieval bard as strolling carefreely through beautiful countryside is to erase the reality of miles of mud, snow, and uneven terrain, nights of hunger and exposure, constant threats from bandits, weather, and disease, and the unrelenting social vulnerability that came with being a traveling entertainer. Their journey was perilous, their art inseparable from survival, and their existence defined by endurance, courage, and adaptability. The road was not a stage, it was a crucible, and the bards who survived it carried with them the stories, songs, and resilience that allowed culture to persist in a world that was otherwise harsh, unforgiving, and indifferent to human suffering. Traveling through medieval Europe as a bard was not merely a physical ordeal, it was also a battle against disease, filth, and the ever-watchful gaze of the church. To survive the roads, the towns, and the courts, bards had to navigate a world where sickness could strike with devastating speed, where the stench of decay and uncleanliness was a constant companion, and where moral and religious authorities could condemn their very presence. Life was precarious on every level, and survival was never guaranteed. Consider first the challenge of disease. The Middle Ages were a time before modern medicine, before antibiotics, before knowledge of germs or hygiene. Illnesses that today are easily treated could be fatal then. A minor wound could fester into gangrene, a small fever could turn into death, and common ailments such as dysentery, typhoid, or the plague could sweep through villages with terrifying speed. Bards, traveling constantly through multiple towns, forests, and cities, were uniquely vulnerable. Their lives forced them into exposure, crowded inns, filthy streets, open fields, and the unsanitary conditions of rural villages. They came into contact with strangers, animals, contaminated water, and spoiled food. Every journey was a gamble with disease, every handshake or shared cup a potential death sentence. Hygiene was another impossible challenge. Bathing was infrequent and often discouraged due to fear of illness. Clothes, cloaks, and shoes were seldom washed and often infested with lice or fleas. Hair was unkempt, and beards, if present, could harbor insects. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed with sweat, smoke from cooking fires, and the odor of animals was overwhelming. The roads themselves were filthy, covered with mud, animal waste, and refuse from humans who had no means of proper sanitation. Bards, who slept outdoors or in makeshift lodgings, were constantly exposed to these hazards. Infestations, infections, and skin diseases were common and debilitating, further threatening survival and the ability to perform. Nutrition was inadequate. Meals were irregular and meager, especially for itinerant entertainers with little to barter or spend. Bread was often stale or moldy, meat was a luxury, and vegetables could be scarce. Bards frequently subsisted on what they could earn through performances, begging, or scavenging. Malnutrition weakened the body, compromised immunity, and made illness more likely. The combination of poor diet, exposure to the elements, and constant travel created conditions where disease could thrive. Even a minor cold could become dangerous, turning into pneumonia in winter or lingering as a debilitating illness that prevented performance and income. Medical care, when available, was rudimentary and often harmful. Physicians relied on bleeding, herbal remedies, and spiritual rituals rather than scientific knowledge. Treatments could be as dangerous as the illnesses themselves. Bards lacking wealth, social status, or the protection of powerful patrons rarely had access to doctors or proper care. Folk remedies might offer some relief, but often they were ineffective or poisonous. For a traveling bard, a minor injury or illness could quickly become life-threatening. Even those who survived carried the long-term effects, chronic pain, permanent injuries, and lingering illness that could make travel and performance increasingly difficult. Filth and exposure were constant companions. Towns and villages were crowded and unsanitary. Streets were unpaved, often layered with mud, waste, and garbage. Rivers and wells could be contaminated, spreading disease through drinking water. Open sewers, piles of refuse, and the lack of proper sanitation facilities made towns dangerous for anyone without wealth or status. Bards, as itinerant outsiders, were particularly vulnerable. They had little choice but to drink from wells or rivers, sleep in the streets or stables, and navigate conditions that exposed them to both infection and injury. The risk of disease was compounded by exhaustion, malnutrition, and exposure, creating a daily struggle for survival that few modern imaginations can comprehend. Beyond the physical dangers, the Church exerted a profound influence over the lives of bards. Music, storytelling, and humor were often seen as distractions from spiritual devotion, and wandering entertainers were viewed with suspicion. The Church held immense power in medieval Europe, shaping laws, moral expectations, and social behavior. Bards, who traveled freely, entertained freely, and sometimes satirized the powerful, could easily be seen as threats to religious or social order. Their art, which we might view today as cultural enrichment, was frequently interpreted as morally suspect or spiritually dangerous. In some regions, bards were accused of promoting lust, heresy, or sinful behavior. Songs about love or passion could be condemned as corrupting. Tales that mocked the powerful or questioned accepted norms could be seen as subversive. The moral scrutiny was pervasive, and punishment could be swift. A bard might be barred from a town, denied lodging, or forbidden from performing publicly. In extreme cases, church authorities could demand physical punishment or excommunication. Even in areas where tolerance was greater, the pressure to conform to religious expectations shaped the content and delivery of every performance. Bards had to balance their creativity with the need to avoid offending not only secular authorities, but also spiritual ones. Religious festivals and public ceremonies added complexity to the bard's life. These events could be opportunities for earning food, coins, or recognition, but they were also occasions when moral scrutiny was heightened. The audience included clergy, nobles, and townsfolk, all observing not only the quality of performance, but also its conformity to accepted moral and religious standards. Humor and satire were risky. Songs or stories that entertained peasants could offend nobles or clergy. A misjudged performance could result in expulsion, punishment, or worse. Bards constantly navigated these overlapping layers of expectation, their survival dependent on understanding the delicate balance between entertainment and propriety. Even the Church's influence extended to death. Burial was not guaranteed for wandering entertainers. In some areas, bards who died away from home or without family support were denied interment in consecrated ground, leaving them at the mercy of local authorities or improvised graves. The denial of proper burial reflected the broader marginalization bards faced in life. Their art was needed, their presence tolerated, yet their personhood and spiritual rights were precarious. The threat of social and spiritual exclusion was as real as the dangers of disease and exposure, shaping a life defined by constant negotiation and vigilance. Economic vulnerability compounded these physical and spiritual hazards. Bards rarely had savings or resources to weather illness or injury. A single bout of sickness could erase weeks of earnings, leaving them unable to pay for food, shelter, or protection. Instruments, the tools of their trade, were fragile and expensive to repair or replace. Theft, misfortune, or natural disasters could destroy their ability to perform, making survival uncertain. The combination of disease, exposure, moral scrutiny, and economic precarity created a life where even minor setbacks could escalate into crises. Despite these relentless challenges, bards persisted. Their art was not merely for entertainment, it was a lifeline. Music and storytelling could secure food, shelter, and protection. Songs preserved history, culture, and memory. Stories connected communities and carried news across vast distances. The risks of exposure, disease, and church scrutiny were constant, yet the rewards, when temporary favor was gained, were vital for survival. Performance was a calculated act, balancing creativity, diplomacy, and risk management. Every note, every lyric, every story was deployed strategically, a delicate negotiation with the physical, social, and spiritual world. The resilience of bards was extraordinary. They endured fever, malnutrition, exhaustion, filth, and social marginalization, yet continued to travel and perform. Their creativity became inseparable from survival, their art inseparable from endurance. They navigated roads rife with disease, towns rife with moral scrutiny, and social networks that were both helpful and hostile. Every performance carried risk, and every journey demanded courage, adaptability, and determination. The bard's life was a testament to human resilience in a world defined by danger, uncertainty, and the harsh realities of medieval existence. Even in these conditions, bards found moments of reprieve and meaning. A warm fire, a receptive audience, or the simple act of producing music could offer temporary relief from the hardships of the road. Music and storytelling became both a coping mechanism and a tool of survival. They allowed bards to assert agency, to navigate social hierarchies, and to create connection in a world that often denied them stability or security. These moments, though fleeting, were precious, sustaining the bard through the relentless challenges of disease, dirt, and moral scrutiny. In the end, the combination of illness, filth, and religious oversight shaped every aspect of a bard's life. Their existence required constant vigilance, physical endurance, and mental resilience. Disease could strike without warning, sanitation was nearly non-existent, and moral authorities could condemn their very presence. Yet despite these obstacles, bards continued to travel, perform, and preserve culture. Their survival depended on skill, intelligence, courage, and adaptability. Each song sung, each story told, each mile traveled, was an act of defiance and resilience, a testament to the indomitable spirit required to endure in a harsh and unforgiving world. To imagine a medieval bard as carefree or romantic is to ignore the reality of their existence. They lived among disease, dirt, and scrutiny, navigating a world where every misstep could be fatal, every performance a test of skill and survival, and every journey a negotiation with the physical, social, and spiritual dangers of their era. Theirs was a life defined by endurance, courage, and the profound interconnection between art and survival, a life that was simultaneously dangerous, marginalized, and yet indispensable for the preservation of history and culture.